I never spoken in front of such a group of students that are mature like you are, and it's of course nice mixture. Thanks to Bob that they selected not only economists but also the philosophers, political scientists. There are some computer scientists, etc., etc. So it gives us a very nice diversity. And of course, that special feature of you, which is the military service. And that is something what is very different from our student. And when you were talking about that experience to me, so I was curious, I was looking, how is that with the military service in Europe? And look at that. It's unfortunately in Slovak, but you see the Europe, and those countries in light blue have no military service, no conscription, no. And those who are having, the number on their country means months. How many months of the service is there? So it's 6, 8, 12, whatever. And I'm now, I understand why the world, the rest of the world sees us like this. So this is for the rest of the world, Europe. Europe, that is something to laugh at, with all these things we've made, LGBT, our COVID-19 policies, then the electric cars, etc., etc. So this is the things that will definitely change in Europe, and I believe in 5 years' time I will be speaking to a group of students in our region. They will be having the same, things to do as you do also. So let me come back to the. I was asked by Chananel not allow any questions for 45 minutes. Otherwise, they say I have too many slides I didn't go through. Okay? Okay. But coming back to the issue of the conscription, this is really interesting, and you can think about that when we are talking about freedom and economic freedom, that it is not as simple as it looks, that we are always pro-freedom. Because freedom, to maximize our freedom, personal freedom, would mean no conscription. Yeah? But in your situation, I cannot imagine that you will have that opportunity. So it's not your option, actually. You are, and in the indices, you are getting lower score because you have conscription as compared to other countries that do not have any conscription. So it's much more difficult and nuanced with the freedoms because you need to take into account also other factors. Then, coming back to what I said on Monday, you can forget everything what I said. You don't need to remember anything if you will remember this chart. This is a very important chart that is basically summarizing everything what I said. The chart is comparing Austria, economic growth of Austria. You see that this, what is it? Blue? Black curve, and Czechoslovakia, which is the red curve. And you see that after the World War II, the both former parts of Austro-Hungarian Empire, meaning Austria and Czechoslovakia, started from the very similar, almost the same starting point in terms of GDP per capita. In 1947-48, they had the very same GDP per capita. And then what happened in 1948? In 1948, Austria stayed with more free market, not free market, but more market-based economy, while Czechoslovakia opted for communism. So the difference between growth rates of Czechoslovakia and Austria, and you see that gap was opening up. That is the cost of having communism. So we should all be teaching that in Czechoslovakia, in Czech Republic and Slovakia, our students looking at this and saying the GDP would be in Czechoslovakia and then in our republics much higher at the end of at the end of 80s if there would be no communism, but we would go for market-based system. So this is really the cost of communism. And with this, and with everything what I said to you on Monday, you know by more about our recent history than 95% of students in Slovakia, because we have very strange way of teaching history. We have some people studying history. Where are they? Don't say anything, please. Don't say anything. In our curricula, we spent years and years teaching very ancient history, spending a lot of time in Stone Age, Bronze Age, then going to Middle Age and staying there. And then when the most recent history, 20th century history, is there, the teachers do not have time to teach it. So our kids are dependent on 20th century history, on what their parents and grandparents keep saying them. And what the grandparents keep saying them, don't answer. Of course, because they were young under the communism, they paint a rosy picture of that system, saying, of course, there were some mistakes, but it was not all that bad, etc. So our kids are now much more fragile in terms of any kinds of ideology saying communism was good and it can come back. It was not good, and we have economic proof of that, and this is the cost of communism. So this is what I wanted to tell you. And maybe to add the second remark on that, as I told you, the economists, they are divided into two groups, like natural scientists, one of them believing in God, the others do not believe in God. Economists, some of them believe in government and some of them believing in market. And these two group of economists, they formed, we can say, two teams. The bad guys are in the red jerseys, of course, in my world, and the good guys are in the blue jerseys. And in 1920s, there was the famous debate of Austrian economists, Friedrich August von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and socialist economics of that time, economists Oskar Lange, Abba Lerner, Maurice Dobb, and others. And Austrian economists, knowing everything about economy and economics, they said socialism is impossible to work on a long time. It is doomed to collapse. The socialist economists, they, in that debate, were defending socialism. They received the news from, it was in the 20s, from Soviet Union. Soviet Union was booming. The growth rates were impressive. There was the electrification of Russia. There was the industrialization of Russia. So they were impressed and said, well, the socialism is even superior system to capitalism. But who was right finally? Don't answer. Of course. So reality confirmed that socialists were completely wrong and believing in a wrong God, which was government. So, and today, this is my last time we are together, and because we are so special group, I thought that it would be good to, because so special group means, among other things, what? That there are some future ministers or maybe future prime ministers around the table. So this is going to be the manual of reforms for future ministers and future prime ministers. So let's start with the Pareto principle. We know what is Pareto principle. The most of us know, maybe they apply it in everyday life, in their work, etc. So Pareto principle means that you should look at what you can do with 20% of your efforts and to achieve 80% of the result. So I would then, based on the recommendation of Pareto principle, recommend you that if you want Israel to be the modern country, modern economy, you don't need or you don't try to reform everything. It's impossible, because then you end up risking reforming nothing. So it means that the better strategy based on Pareto principle is to think about 1, 2, or 3 maximum reforms that could help modernize Israeli economy the most. And I believe, from my own experience, that these are 3 most important things that can bring long-term sustainable prosperity to Israel. Not only to Israel, it's a universal recipe, I believe. Number 1, it is improvement of business environment for entrepreneurs and companies to thrive, because that's the very foundation of any prosperity. Number 2, reforming tax reform would be nice, because it's always the nightmare, the way how the government collects money. And the 3, pension reform, because it is the mother of all reforms. It is reforming the by far the largest item on public expenditures. So it is for sustainability of the country, very important area. So, of course, every time when you think about doing something, you have this political economy dilemma, because you have 3 basic options. Number 1, staying or keeping status quo. Those politicians who just want to be in politics and not do nothing, want to do nothing, so they prefer that first option. Then second thing is fine-tuning. You say, okay, I will go for reform of business environment, flat tax reform, pension reform, all of them. But you will just do some kind of fine-tuning, changing them small, playing the game with the small parameters. But you, as the future ministers and future prime ministers, are not about fine-tuning. You have the higher ambition, which is you want radical reforms, big changes, and big changes are called paradigmatic reforms. You change the paradigm in the system. So let's start with the improvements of business environment. That's my copyright. When I was for about 20 years busy with trying to either persuade politicians to improve business environment or improve it myself when I was at the Ministry of Economy. And I was always struggling, because not always people understood what actually the business environment is, what we need to do. And I believe the nice analogy is the aquarium. So think about the economy as the aquarium. So you see in the aquarium, of course, you have the fishes, you have the water, you have filters, you have the glass case of the aquarium itself. And so where is the economy? You can think about the companies, that the companies are like fishes in the aquarium. Then you have business aquarium, business environment, and business environment is the water in the aquarium. Filters, lights, electricity, whatever what is necessary for keeping well-functioning aquarium is infrastructure. And then who is the missing there? There is missing a caretaker of aquarium. That is someone who makes sure that there is actually electricity, there is the clean water, there is the fishes are fed on time, etc., etc. So economy is aquarium. As I said, who is actually the man or the someone who is taking care of aquarium? It is the government. Government, you can think about as a caretaker of that aquarium. And then now we start with the problem. The problem is that if you would ask someone in the government, anywhere in the world, what do they think about themselves they are doing? They believe that they are doing great things for businesses. They are rolling out the red carpet, that they are helping some companies, some industries, and this is what they think the best they can do. But what they actually do, this is what they actually do. The most governments actually have policies of unnecessary restrictions for businesses. I underline unnecessary. We will come back to that later, because you need certain, as it was said yesterday several times, you need some rules. But most of the rules are unnecessarily complex and unnecessarily restrictive. And then the second sin of the governments used to be that, of course, the companies and entrepreneurs are for them the source of revenue. But they cannot be seen only as the source of revenue, because then they are like governments are only milking the cow. But you need to be sure that it is not the only function, and this is unfortunately the mistake of most of the governments. So the result is usually that aquarium is not very well taken care of. Usually the water is far from being clean. It is actually dirty. Dirty water in the aquarium, meaning the bad business environment in economy, is not necessarily bad news for everybody. It is not bad news for some gangsters, someone who is not complying with the law, because they feel best when there is no transparent environment and they are not seen in what they are doing. So that is the problem. What are the ways how government, as the caretaker of aquarium, is polluting the economic waters? Then, number one, it is taxes. Number two, grants and financial support. Number three, laws and regulations. We will be speaking about tax reform later on. Grants and financial support is so obvious that I will skip it. We have the very big problem you do not have here, which is EU funds. You can say it's like, manna from heaven. We are receiving the money free of charge. But what we are doing with this money? You have two hotels and we subsidize your hotel, but your hotel next across the street, we don't subsidize. The same people, they compete to each other, but it's completely unfair to use money and the subsidies in this way, because it is distorting competition. So we will focus next on the third area, which is regulations. And I tried, as I told you, I spent 17 years as the president of the Entrepreneurs Association of Slovakia, trying to explain governments and politicians this very simple thing, that we need to clean up the water. We need to avoid the measures government is doing to make the water dirty. But it was like I was never heard of. The things were worse and worse. And as you can see from this picture, this is the number of requirements that were found in a body of legislation in Slovakia year by year. You can see the number of requirements for businesses were growing, growing, and growing. So I felt like somebody on the picture. Who is the gentleman? You can say that. Don Quixote. It's Don Quixote. Why I felt as a Don Quixote? Don Quixote was fighting the windmills. And that's the analogy. I realized that it fits only by 50%, because the Don Quixote is the analogy of the failed fight. You are fighting, but you lose. But then I realized that it's a very bad analogy for me, actually, because Don Quixote was fighting against windmills. Why? Because he saw not windmills, he saw the giants. He thought that the windmills are giants and he was fighting them. It is not analogy for fighting against regulations, because regulations are not fictitious. The regulations are something very real. So I needed to find another analogy in history. So this is my friend. This is what I felt like the years and by year, talking about the reforms in Slovakia as a Sisyphus. Yeah. So we now talk about this one specific thing government is doing to pollute the business environment, which are regulations. And in some countries it is more serious problem, in some countries it is less. In a country like Slovakia, as I told you, we have privatized everything. And usually the ownership is the biggest asset for the government to do bad things with the economy. So if our government has no state-owned companies, basically, there are a few, but very unimportant. So what is the next best for the government to do to exercise the influence over the economy? You don't have the state companies, you have regulations. That is why we are regulating like hell in Slovakia. And to understand, to do something about regulations, you need to understand very important question. Where do our laws and regulations come from? It's a pity I cannot get the answers. But it's prohibited by Chananel. I respect the rules. So we definitely know that the first regulations we know about, the camera is talking to me. Very good. Camera has no restrictions. So we know where the first regulations come to us. From heaven. So Moses received the first regulations, 10 commandments, from God. Yeah? But the question is then, in modern societies, where are the regulations coming from? And there are two major driving forces of regulations, and they are both making that very difficult to fight against new regulations. Because number one, we all people want, in some situations, more regulations. It was said by the speaker about the public choice. He said, people want regulations. Exactly. So it is The world is not perfect. Around us are many imperfections. And every time we see something that can be fixed, the most natural recipe in our mind is it should be regulated. There should be some law to fix that problem. So there is this demand for regulations coming from everywhere, and that is why it's so difficult to fight against that pressure. So that's number one. Number two, we as the civilized society are, I'm not sure if you noticed it because we are in a special sort of security situation. But I see that in Europe as a very strong tendency that people are more and more risk averse. They hate risk, but the life is full of risks, naturally. But the people would like government to regulate everything, to push the probability of risk to zero, but it is impossible. So now I have the chart that is a little bit maybe difficult, but I will explain you. That's exactly what I said right now. If you think about the relationship between two things, number one, we try to protect us against risks, which is the horizontal line, and you have zero protection or 100% protection. And then if you want to increase our protection from zero, so you say, government, please adopt that rule, that will make us safer. So government adopts the rule, and it's a vertical axis, where you see number of regulations, and you see that the costs of these regulations for businesses, for consumers, for everybody is going up. If you have zero regulations, zero protection, zero costs, then you start to introduce regulations. And the trick is that with the first regulations, with the first costs, you receive a very large, improvement in terms of protection. But there is a certain point where that positive relation stops. You can implement more and more regulations, but it has almost no impact on better protection. So, for example, we have in Slovakia the labor code that is 250 pages long. 250 pages. You have on each page something as a requirement for businesses to protect employees. 250 pages. I believe that is almost everything what you can have of a trade union in our trade law, our labor code. Now, according to this, you could expand our labor code by another 250 pages. It could be 500 with 1,000 new requirements, but the protection of employees would not increase much. So you see that you will never get the 100% protection, and beyond certain point, which is difficult sometimes to calculate, there is wasting money, wasting human potential, but no protection. So it should be the prohibited zone, and this is I call unnecessary regulation. I will just give you one concrete example. When I was the vice minister, I was in my office maybe 1 week, and I received the ministerial decree to sign about significant increase of safety of children's playgrounds in Slovakia. It would cost municipalities, cities, villages in Slovakia millions and millions of euro. So I read through the whole document, and I said, I am not going to sign it because it's not going to protect anybody. It's not the measure of the life saving, because There are no fatal accidents on the playgrounds. There are some injuries, and that was the argument that was used when somebody was talking to the previous leadership of the ministry and managed to persuade them to adopt the law that increased the protection of children by making ridiculous requirements. It's like preventing kids from being injured, falling on the ground. They expected to have on each playground, I don't know, 4 or 5 centimeters of the plastic carpet that would prevent the kids from being injured when they fall, etc., etc. So when I was kid, I was also, at the playgrounds. I don't remember that now our generation, somebody died because of playing on the playgrounds. So I stopped that legislation because the law was adopted, but you needed to have the ministerial decree with the details. And we know that devil lies in the details. And details were that some company that was assembling the playgrounds thought that it would be a good idea to have that requirement for everybody to buy their playgrounds. And that is why they managed to persuade the bureaucrats at the ministry to prepare such proposal. And sometimes in public choice theory, you've heard, for example, the statement that bureaucrats, they are dangerous because they have their own goals, etc., etc. It's not my experience. In our country and countries of Central and Eastern Europe, bureaucracy is not dangerous as such. The bureaucracy is dangerous by doing everything what you want them to do. So if you are the good guy, if you are the reformer, of course you ask them to throw the government decree about the playgrounds to the basket. They do that. But the previous leadership asked them to prepare that, to write it. They did it, So it's not about the bureaucracy itself. It's about those people, they are leaderships of the ministries, having the important, and I believe by far the most important role in setting of the policies. Then, so what I did after 2020 when I was at the Ministry of Economy, we have introduced the deregulatory reform where we realized that when you talk about regulations, you need to be aware of the two things. There is a stock of regulation and there is a flow of regulation. What is the stock of regulation? Is it already the 45 minutes or not?
It's the regulation that have yet in the...
So it is about the existing laws and existing regulations. It's like stock of regulation and flow of regulation. It's like debt that is accumulated over time and the deficit. Deficit is something what is newly added to the debt each year. So the stock of regulation, we try to deal with this enormous amount of regulations in Slovakia by, number one, preparing the anti-bureaucratic packages of measures where we canceled many unnecessary requirements for businesses to reduce their costs of doing business, like canceling the government decree on playgrounds. Then we invited the many other, the general public, we invited the businesses to come up with their experience and identify unnecessary burdens on them. So we collected them and we have managed to prepare and to give to the government for approval 3 packages. One was with 100, second one was with 200, and third with 300 measures. And I can tell you that this was the part that was taking the largest part of my time and the largest part of my energy, because you can imagine that you identify the measures, you put the package together, but it's not when your job is over. Your job starts at that very moment, because what do you need to do? This is very special thing about the business environment, that it is not the responsibility of single ministry. Business environment is influenced by Ministry of Culture, Ministry of Healthcare, Ministry of Environment, all other ministries. They introduce legislation that is in one way or another having sometimes negative impact on doing business. So the most of that first 100 measures, maybe 80%, were not under the responsibility of the Ministry of Economy. We were, energy, so there were some issues with energy. We solved that within the ministry. But 80% of the things were where we needed to go to Ministry, let's say, of Environment. And then there was a very asymmetric situation. I was there with two of my colleagues. We had the proposal from the business saying, this is our experience, we believe this is not fair, this should be changed. And we assessed the situation, we agreed, and then we came to the ministry. And guess what? I was sitting there with two people, and there were people sitting like those people over there. 15 people. And there were the ministry people, there were the people from the government agency that was actually implementing that legislation. There was the lady sitting on that law for many, many years and being persuaded 100% that it is the best law in the world. There is nothing that you need to change about it. So we needed to fight that sort of asymmetric fight. We were, number one, outnumbered, and number two, they had much more information about that area than us. But despite that, of course, it's not 100 that we started with. We started with 180. So this is the result of the compromise. Somewhere we said, okay, maybe you are right. The entrepreneur sees that from his point of view, but it's not okay. And we gave up. In some cases, the issue was okay, but it was impossible to change the position of the ministry. So that was the result of the compromise. In order not to repeat that painful experience every year, we have introduced the second measure for fighting against the stock of regulation, which was regular, obligatory ex post evaluations of existing regulations for ministries. So it is not, when I left the ministry, it's not about someone else is not doing it and they stopped it. I left the ministry leaving the obligation for all ministries to come up every single year with the list of unnecessary regulations in their area of responsibility. So that's sort of good thing to have such automatic mechanism that is not dependent on if something is equally persuaded about the importance of that or not. So it is existing automatically. And then what about the flow, the new regulations? I've heard yesterday that the Israeli government wrote, I don't know if it is government declaration or whatever, the aim to reduce regulations. And I immediately thought, what actually that means? Because it can mean a lot of different things. Reducing regulation means that you would reduce both stocks You will eliminate existing regulations, and you would reduce the number of new regulations adopted. And usually, when governments are reporting that they are reduced regulations, they did only one thing. They slowed down adoption of new regulations. So in terms of finance, they reduced the deficit, but the deficit is still there and it is adding to the debt, and debt is growing. So regulations are usually everywhere growing, including the European Union, because we have special problem I can come to in a second. Then what I left there at the ministry is again another automatic mechanism. What the ministries are very good at is to invent new regulations. But what they hate is when somebody puts the light on them, and the general public sees them what they are actually doing. So we have designed for that the what we call virtual regulatory accounts. And Ministry of Economy is keeping records of other ministries and publishing it on the web page of the Ministry of Economy. And each ministry, you can find Ministry of Labor, let's say, and you see in 2024, they introduced the regulations that increased the costs of doing business by 40 million for businesses, and they at the same time reduced it by, I don't know, 30 million. So total result of the Ministry of Labor is that they actually contributed to the increase. They are in red color. So you can see immediately the performance of the government and various ministries in terms of their fight against the regulations. Some of them are contributing to the growth, some of them are reducing it. So that's the virtual regulatory accounts, which is again the automatic mechanism. But by far the strongest automatic mechanism we introduced is one in, two out principle. Do you know what is one in, two out? Do you have that something like that in Israel? Contrary. Okay, you don't have that. We haven't invented the one in, two out. We've been inspired by Britain. In UK, they started to do that. When the ministry was introducing new regulation, it was obliged to come up with the proposal to eliminate two other legislations. But we were smarter than British, or we based our system on their experience. And what was their experience? Of course, the ministries are, again, finding their place. And when they were expected to trade one new for two old, what they did? They introduced they introduced new, bold regulation, increasing, costs of doing business by 100 million, let's say. But they exchanged it for two smaller regulations, I don't know, in the amount of 10 million. So they complied with one in, two out as the rules, but it was not contributing to reduction of the burden for businesses. So what we did was we said it will be one in, two out expressed in financial terms. So you need to calculate what are the financial costs, administrative costs for businesses. You need to express it in euros. And then you need to find measures under your responsibility, ideally for the same type of businesses. And you need to eliminate legislation in amounts that is the double of that was introduced. So the financial term, it is very, very important. So that's, again, I left the ministry 2 years ago, but the automatic mechanism is there, and ministries need to comply. And finally, the special problem that is only for us, not for you, because you are not EU country. And in EU countries, you have the serious issue which is debated everywhere, which is the gold plating. And the gold plating is the practice when the member states' bureaucracies are adopting EU legislation. There are the directives where the European Parliament approves what should be done in terms of, I don't know, improved safety of driving. But how is that going to be done? It's usually up to the member states to specify. And when they transpose this legislation to our body of legislation, they usually do more than it is expected when the EU legislation was adopted in Brussels. So they adopt it either earlier or they adopt it in excessively strict and complex manner. And it is, again, cause of the increased costs for businesses that is unnecessary. Tax reform. What is the time? 9:30? 9:20. Okay. So now I can finally ask questions and you can answer. When we come to the tax system, and you see that picture, what you can say about the tax system? What is it? Less holes in the new system, yeah? Okay. Why? Well, Swiss cheese is tasty, isn't it? Doesn't matter how many holes it has. But this is the end of the analogy because the tax system is not Swiss cheese in terms of taste, but it is the Swiss cheese in terms of these holes. And the longer you have the tax system, the more holes you have in it. And if you want to have the modern system that is taxing the people and their activity on the most possible neutral way, not favoring or discriminating against, then you try to eliminate these holes. And what are these holes? It's now getting difficult. It's now why the reform is difficult, because behind every hole is some interest group. And it is not only the evil guys, they want to do something, you know. The many exemptions and these holes in the tax system are actually sounding very nice. And they are very attractive. And you say, why not, you know? So tax incentive for job creation. Why? All governments, they laugh when the jobs are created. They can report, we have helped companies to generate XY jobs. So, that's one of the big holes in the system, because if you support NADAF company, then you not receiving the revenues to the state budget, yeah? But it needs to come from somewhere. It is coming usually from your neighbors who are paying taxes. So again, it's very unfair to help not only to subsidize the companies, but also to encourage them to do anything by tax exemptions or any other incentives. It's not only about job creation, it's about encouraging the FDIs for foreign companies coming to your country. And again, the domestic companies are seeing that always as very unfair, saying, we are here, we are contributing to the state budget, and you are attracting the foreign company that is not paying the taxes for 5 years because they have tax holiday. So it's very unfair. Deprived areas, of course, they have very many reasons to find the ways how to help some regions. But again, if you edit everything together as a system, it is very, very bad. Accelerated depreciation allowances for investment in certain areas. House ownership, that's a big, big issue, of course, everywhere. And the evergreen of all policies, which is SMEs. You know, SMEs are in the heart of what every government does. So we have always special tax regimes for SMEs to help them to grow. What is that? I said small and medium-sized enterprises. And it's usually, we have, again, in EU, we have a common definition. You have micro enterprises. These are companies up to 10 employees. So 1 to 9, it's micro enterprise. From 10 to 50, it is the small enterprise. And from 50 and to 250, it is the medium. And more than 250, it's considered to be large. With some exceptions, because in Germany, it is very big economy. They consider only companies with 500 employees to be large companies. But again, you know, supporting them, it makes the system like this on the left side. So if you want change the tax system that it looks like that, you need to think about the whole system completely differently. Again, remember that debate from 1920s about socialist and Austrian economists? The Austrian economists said socialism will collapse. It's impossible to stay alive. And one of the major reasons they had was that in socialism, because you have state ownership and you have central planning, you have distorted prices. You have prices that are not telling the real story about the value of anything, because it is invented by comrades at the Central Planning Committee. But by, you know, the taxes are basically one instrument that is having the same effect. If you impose the tax on someone and you do not impose the tax on someone else, you are distorting their prices and you are distorting the signal. So they are not necessarily, you are more competitive or you are less competitive. You are just more taxed than you are, you know. So that's the issue that the tax, if it is designed in a bad way, tax system is distorting economic incentives. And to have the better tax system, you need to minimize these distortive effects. And what you need to do then? Well, you need to have the simple tax administration and the lowest possible tax rates. I'm not going through, don't worry, through these details. This is the old system in Slovakia before the reform in 2004 and the new system. What is the major difference is that we had pre-reform progressive income taxation. We had 5 brackets and the maximum was 38%. Then we had all kinds of other taxes like dividend tax, real estate transfer tax, inheritance tax, etc., etc. So what we did, number one, we flattened the rate structure in the system. So it was not the 38, it was 19%. And the 19% was for all kinds of taxes. So that is why it was called flat tax. We introduced flat tax to Slovakia, flat tax of 19%. And 19 was personal income tax, 19 was corporate income tax. We abolished the dividend tax, real estate tax, and we abolished the inheritance and gift tax. So we have, number one, simplified rate structures by having just one, replaced all others. And number two, simplified the whole system. And by that, you achieve two things. Number one, the companies having the lower tax burden considered that system to be more fair, and they stopped optimizing their tax liability. In all system, if you were facing the high, tax rates, what we were doing? You were optimizing the taxes in order to pay minimum, yeah? With the 19%, they stopped doing it because even optimizing taxes costs something. You need to pay someone for invoice, whatever. It was about 15% having this optimization done. So if you are optimizing taxes and risking that you will be caught by authorities and sentenced, or you pay 19%, so you opted for paying 19%. And that was it. So what was the result of that more simple system? Companies started to pay more taxes. And there were, unlike our socialist critiques told us, if you reduce the tax rates, you will have less money in the state budget. It was vice versa. We reduced the tax rates, but the companies, because they started paying, they paid actually more, and the revenues of the government increased after the introduction of such a reform. And then, as your future ministers, as future prime ministers, you do not need to wait until that moment you will be at the Ministry of Finance and having the possibility to introduce such kind of tax. You can start campaigning for improvement of your tax system today with your NGO, with any activity you can imagine. So what I did in 90s, I was a founding father of the Hayek Foundation in Slovakia. As I told you, Hayek Foundation was the free market think tank and also do tank. So what we did, we were number one campaigning for flat tax. We tried to change the public opinion because, of course, the Minister of Finance of that time said, we don't need any reform, we have the standard tax system of the standard European country. No change is necessary. So we campaigned for the flat tax. And the most powerful thing I did was that with the friends from the Heritage Foundation, I was in the US, I managed to come to Steve Forbes' office. You know the Steve Forbes, the owner of the Forbes magazine, and who was running for president with the idea of the flat tax. He was running for the idea that Americans, our tax system should be like you would be able to fill your tax obligation on postcard. It should be so simple. So I managed with the friends from the Heritage Foundation to visit him in his office, and I told him, Mr. Forbes, I know that you were running for president with the idea of the flat tax, and you failed terribly. And if you want to see the small country that is actually going to implement the flat tax in a couple of months, come and see us. And actually he took his plane and landed in Bratislava. We have organized the big events. I brought him to president. I brought him to Minister of Finance of that time. I brought him everywhere to media. And that was one of the, I'm not saying that it was a decisive factor, but it was one of the factors saying, oh my God, if such successful people like billionaire from US says that it's a very good thing, maybe that is some good thing about the flat tax. So finally, we had adopted the flat tax, and Steve Forbes returned back to the US, and he wrote the commentary to the Forbes that was called Investor's Paradise. And since the time of that commentary, Slovakia started to be called Central European Tiger, Hong Kong of Europe, and it was unbelievable uh, incentive for the foreigners to come to Slovakia because we had a well-known reputation of the reform-oriented country with the investment climate that was the paradise for not only for foreign investors but equally for the local domestic investors. So this is one thing you can do. You can find some success stories in other parts of the world, and you can show that to your businesses, to your general public. The other thing, in 90s we have established the special purpose arm of the Hayek Foundation, and it was Slovak Taxpayers Association. And Slovak Taxpayers Association started to calculate and publish so-called Tax Freedom Day. You know what is the Tax Freedom Day? It's is it what?
It's a day you don't pay taxes.
Yes, it is, and it is the way how to tell the story of the true tax burden to average people without technical language and details that would be lost in. So the tax freedom, it's, let's say you have rate of redistribution 50% of the GDP, meaning that you collect from the people and from businesses 50% amount of revenues, that is 50% of the GDP. What is the tax freedom day in that situation? If you calculate that on the calendar days, it's the middle of the year. So it's if you have a 50% of the tax burden, your tax freedom day is July 1st. It's half of the year when you make money and the government takes all of your money, and that only after 50%, when you start on July the 1st, you earn the money, you receive, you are having the money you earn. So government is not taking virtually from you. So it is, Tax Freedom Day was the way how the people started to understand what is the true level of the tax burden. And they said, oh my God, this is really like that? I'm really paying so much taxes? And of course, you can imagine the Ministry of Finance is still until today hating that project because always say, it's not like that, they are having the wrong numbers, whatever. But it's excellent project for anybody who would like to involve the general public into demand for positive reforms and that would like to open the debate if there is no debate about things like that. So this is it. And if you use different way of calculation of the tax burden, you can see, and if you add also the way where the government is taxing you indirectly, so you are not considering only income tax, social security contributions, you pay directly, your employer is paying directly to the state, then you are receiving the net salary, but you go to the shop and you pay for goods, and there is a value added tax. So you pay actually more. And this is the chart saying you that what is left for you after paying all taxes, it's actually, what is the number? 46 something. The red part is income tax and social security contributions, and the largest part of that red is maybe half of that is the contributions paid to old age pension system to pay the pensions of seniors. And it brings us to the third reform, which is the pension reform. And I believe this is by far the most important one because it is like the previous two reforms are important, of course, because number one, it is about the conditions, how the businesses are doing their business and how to increase the efficiency of the economy. Number two, tax reform is about the way how to collect money in least distortive way and the most neutral way. And pension reform is about what we are going to do with the enormous time bomb that is sitting with the every advanced economy. We have an issue with the demography. We have aging of the population on one side, and we have the declining birth rates. And as a result of that, our systems are in deep troubles, and they generate what is called the inherent liabilities that are in the system. They are hidden and not known by general public. So it is, in my view, mother of all reforms, because it is about the largest government spending. And this debate about the pension reform is misleading, because you see that two hands, the old one and the young one, and the pension reform is not about the old hand, as you would expect. Pension reforms are not about me, about the gray hair people in their 60s. The pension reform and debate if to implement it as soon as possible is about you and about younger people than you, because in 20 or 30 years' time, if we will not do nothing today, the whole system explodes and you will receive no pensions whatsoever from the government. So this is about the pension system. And the system as we have it today, I will come back to that in a minute, we have since 19th century. But what was before 19th century? We had societies had no formalized pension systems. There was one exception. Since Roma time, the members of the army, they had entitlement and they were paid some amounts of money in their later ages. So everything was based on individual responsibility plus charity if someone ended up in troubles. And it is the individual responsibility of people of that time is expressed in fairy tales. I don't know about Israel, but in Slovakia, there is the famous fairy tale, and the versions of that are also in other Central European countries. And it's the tale about the 3 coins, pennies, or 3 groschen. And that is the fairy tale about what economists would call intergenerational solidarity. And that is the story about the smart, poor man who is receiving 3 coins as the salary. And what he does with these 3 coins is, he is, number one, using 1 coin to feed his family. Number 2, using the 2nd coin for taking care of his parents, because his parents were taking care of him when he was young. So he's just returning that debt with the 2nd coin to his parents. That's the pension system of that time. And the 3rd coin went to his kids to give them the enough resources to take care of him when he would be old. So that was the pension system of that time. When that informal system was changed, you know, sometimes we don't know the date or something. In this case, we know very exactly where, when, and who introduced the first government-run mandatory system. You know where what? Not bad try. Chile will come to the story in a minute. But we need to start in different country. the first system, mandatory system in the world, was introduced in Germany by the guy who probably know everybody, Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck was famous by which? What he was accomplishing. He unified Germany. And he was a very funny guy. Among other things, when we come back to the regulations, you know what was one of his famous quotes? Bismarck said, you don't want to know how the laws are prepared, because the laws are like sausages. It's better not to know how they are prepared. So that was the Bismarck. And Bismarck was under very heavy pressure of Marxists of that time, saying the people are dying, poor people are dying on the streets, nobody taking care of them, etc., etc. So when he was under the pressure, then he decided to introduce the first system, and I believe it was 1881. You can check it, 1881. But that system, the Bismarck was not stupid. He introduced that system, but he introduced it for anyone over 70. What does it mean?
Life expectancy back then was
Not so many people waited until the 70, because most of them died before. So, so that system at that time, with the age of 70 as the pension age, was completely financially sound and sustainable. But later on, when the system was adopted also by other countries, it turned to be the Ponzi scheme, meaning that you put the money into the system, you immediately pay out to pensioners, and there are no money stayed in the system. It's constantly in the deficit. It's really a Ponzi scheme. You know what is the Ponzi scheme? I don't need to explain that. You know, the gentleman. And that system is, as it was designed by Bismarck, it's called unfunded, number one, because there are no money staying in the system. It's just going through the system. If we are the society, and there is a line between those who are active, you know, you are entrepreneurs, employees, you pay the taxes, and we have pensioners here. So you pay every month to the government, and the government every month sending the money to pensioners. In the system, there is nothing stayed. So it's called unfunded and pay-as-you-go system. And it means that there are no savings generated or accumulated in the system, which was okay in a Bismarck time, but again, remember what I said in the beginning, demographic change, aging of the population, and that division line between those who are economically active and those who are pensioners changed. So what do you do if you pay, as I showed you, very large portion of your salary already to pensioners to finance the system? So you cannot increase that money more. What do you do when half of you will join the pensioners? And it's only you who are expected to, of course, to provide enough resources for your family and provide enough resources for paying pensioners. And then imagine I am a government, I am a politician. So I see this trend. This is the economically active population that is shrinking. Pensioners, numbers are growing. So what do? You stop listening to these guys and you start listening to these guys. Yes? So we have in Slovakia, for example, 13 pension. So the politicians wanted to be generous to pensioners. And they said, well, 12 pensions, the pensioners are poor, then we need to give them more money. We give them the 13 pension as the, to have more resources. We had 1 year, there was always also the 14 pension. So the government, the politicians were paying 14 pensions during 12 months. You are unable to finance the system like that without sending it with these measures to bankruptcy. And as you can see, after 1881, a number of countries that adopted that very similar system of Bismarck is now close to 200, meaning almost all countries in the world have kind of formal, unfunded, government-run pension system. And you have, for example, what is International Labour Organization? The organization that is the largest organization where employers of all over the world and trade unions are meeting and negotiating. So that organization called the Bismarckian system one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. But it is actually the vehicle for bribing citizens, because citizens, they are expecting you are a pensioner. So that illusion, as from the Ponzi scheme you have, and my parents had, everybody had, was I was working for the whole of my life. I paid government for my pension. And the people intuitively thought that the government is not sending money to other pensioners. The government is keeping their money as saving, and they feel they are entitled to get that money back. So most of the average people, they do not understand that this money disappeared 40 years ago, 39 years ago, year by year, month by month. No savings, nothing at all. So what is the dangerous about this situation with the aging? For example, you see the European situation. While Europe was having the 6% of the GDP that was necessary to finance the pensions, it was in 2000 12%, and in 2050 it is expected to be 20% of the GDP. So the costs are, exploding. That's a very complicated chart, but if you find the line number 3, you see these blue columns over there are indicating you to what extent are old age expenditures, not only old age, but also healthcare, so associated with aging, expected to grow. So the longer is the column, the deeper problem you have. And we are number 3 in Europe with this problem. So it is expected that after Luxembourg and Malta, I believe, we are the 3rd country with the largest expected increase for pensions. And then, so what is the way out from this? It seems like almost hopeless or impossible situation to do. We have another after Bismarck, almost exactly 100 years after him, another gentleman, which is José Piñera. José Piñera was the Minister of Labor in 80s in Chile. And he, again, was part of those economists believing in market, believing in people, believing that the people are making individual better decisions than the politicians on their behalf. So the Jose managed to persuade the government, God bless you, to implement the reform that allowed the people sending money to government to keep part of that money on their account. So he created privately owned individual citizens accounts, pension accounts, and they started to, as a consequence of the reform, part of their money having actually what they thought for ages that it is like that. Jose did it. So he said, okay, every citizen has the privately owned individual pension account, and from day one, when you pay the taxes, the certain amount of money are going to sit on your account and enjoying what power of compound interest. So you, over time, are getting richer than to expect the money to be sent from the government. It's you control partially your own destiny. So it was in 1981, and again, what I did with the pension reform in Slovakia was very similar, like with the tax reform. When we wanted to introduce the reform, similar reform like in Chile, I thought it would be useful to send an email to Jose. So I did it, and he replied immediately. And so he accepted my invitation to go to Slovakia. We organized several very big conferences with all policymakers, politicians, with media. And Jose is a very talented speaker, and he has a gift of speaking about these complicated issues in a very simple language. So he was able to persuade also part of our political elite, you know. So the result of his several visits is that with the help of my team, we sent a couple of people to the Ministry of Labor. Minister was political leader, but the team experts from my foundation actually prepared the reform of the a la Jose Piñera. And finally, we have managed to implement it. And in the very last moment, we have realized that in Parliament there is the proposal saying, okay, the individual saving accounts will be established, but there will be no private ownership, without ownership. So you will send your money, you will save this money, you will use it as the pensioner, but when you die, the savings will go back to the system, to the state. And that was the so significant distortion of the system that we fought against by compiling the delegation of members of the parliament, sending them to the Chile. And Jose had several meetings with the parliamentarians, persuading them that it's a stupid idea in the very final moment to implement personal individual accounts without ownership. So there must be the ownership. So they returned back to Slovakia, and the system was approved with the ownership. And we have those who know Jose. Jose can be very, he's very insisting on some things. So he was very pushy and saying we need to write a story about that introduction of the reform in Slovakia. So we have produced the small blue booklet, not red one, blue one, of the story of that reform. Okay, so we have now a system that is there from 2005. It was a huge success because in the first year, 65% of eligible citizens opted to go to that system because they had the option. That was the template or the design of the reform. We didn't want to force anybody. If you feel you are better off in the old system, you can stay there. If you want to be in the new one, you can opt for it. 65% of all people. And the half of what we pay to the pension system was possible to send to our accounts, half of that. So 2 minutes. So that was our reform. I will skip lessons. We can discuss these lessons. I am staying here still today, so we can debate it. For reforms, you need, I believe, open crisis, as we had in 90s. The country was mismanaged from macroeconomic and microeconomic point of view, and there was the general public having the sense of urgency of the reforms that invited us, those people that were ready to implement changes, but need to have also the right inspirations, like Adam Smith, Friedrich von Hayek, those appreciating importance of freedom. So what I would like to do, you don't need to remember anything what I said again in details. Just remember 4 pictures I showed you on Monday and today. Picture with the cost of communism, picture of aquarium as the analogy for good business environment, aquarium with the clean water, picture of the Swiss cheese with many holes as the symbol of bad tax system, and a picture of 3 grošies or coins as the symbol of very good system when the pensions are dependent on the people being smart and responsible. And Bismarck system was taking responsibility from the people, saying, you don't need to take care of your parents. We take care of them. Just pay us for that and we will take care of them. And that's one of the unintended consequences of systems like pay-as-you-go system of the pensions. So what should be our ultimate ambition in Slovakia, in Israel? I believe, and you can use it as effort to open the debate. For example, after listening to all lectures of this program, you can campaign for Slovakia. We can campaign back in Slovakia. We do that. And you can campaign in Israel to make it to top 10 in the Fraser Institute Economic Freedom Index or all other competitive indices, because it is the way how to bring the prosperity to Israel. I have no time. So I have just the last 2 slides where I wanted to share with you what I wrote 10 years ago. I wrote, when I was representing businesses, 10 commandments of the politician that wants to improve the business environment. And when I was in politics at the Ministry of Economy, I remembered that I wrote the 10 commandments. So I checked what I do at the ministry against what I wrote 10 years ago. And thanks God, I need to say I comply with my 10 commandments. I am not going to read them through. You can have them. I will give my presentation and you will have it available. Thank you very much.